And Daniel, we mark the 10-year anniversary of the Iraq War, a war that Dick Cheney recently said was justified because we went after a country that might someday in the future threaten the United States. Yes, that was Dick Cheney's recent justification. But in any case, how it should be. Take it away.
Well, David, the Iraq War marked a seminal moment in my life as an independent thinker and a young adult, as someone who was interested in politics and activism. Because on March 19th, 2003, I was a sophomore in high school. I remember vividly gathering for a small anti-war gathering led by faculty members at my high school, the Ramaz School in Manhattan, New York, as I heard some real truth-telling about the lack of the national security threats that were used to justify the Iraq War. Now, when I think about the Iraq War, I think about institutional failure. I think about being a teenager and initially believing the president's statements and the statements of even many Democrats, and as they were reported in the media, and then slowly looking to alternative information sources and finding that this was a war that was based on lies. And that was a moment of political awakening for me. What are the lies that I'm talking about? Well, for one thing, the administration claimed that Iraq was developing nuclear weapons. And they based this claim on the idea that Iraq purchased yellow cake, which is some kind of a uranium-based substance that is used to potentially make fissile material, from Niger, that Iraq purchased it from Niger. Well, it turns out that, as many journalists unearthed at the time, and that those were based on forged documents and there was no truth to them. That Iraq was using certain kinds of aluminum tubes to develop nuclear warheads. Well, even intelligence analysts at the time said that it was far from clear what those aluminum tubes were being used for. And in fact, the CIA rebuked the president for including those claims in his State of the Union address in 2003. Other claims were that there were mobile chemical weapons labs, and those were brought on by an Iraqi exile named Curveball, who was known to have a drug and alcohol problem and serious conflicts of interest about returning to Iraq. Same thing, Ahmed Chalabi, someone who had a Shiite who had and a businessman who had a tremendous interest in the U.S. invading for that reason, and who fed the United States government information about the ease with which they would be able to rebuild the country. Finally, the biggest claim that was made was that Iraq had connections to Al-Qaeda, which Donald Rumsfeld years later admitted no one ever suggested that. There was no proof of that. That would never be true. Of course, Saddam Hussein was a secular dictator. So in whatever way he used Islam politically, there's very, very little risk that somehow he would have been involved with Al-Qaeda, which is a fundamentalist Islamic group. More than anything, I resented the way that the Iraq War seemed like a foregone conclusion. Hans Blix, one of the UN inspectors, believed that he was making progress and that had he been given more time, he would have been able to find out more about Iraq's weapons systems. And in fact, when the Bush administration did get the Iraqi, they seemed to keep moving the goalposts. So when Saddam Hussein's administration got rid of their long-distance missiles, the Al-Samud missiles, I remember that was one claim. They were saying, well, these inspections are, they may be going all right, but we're still worried about these long-distance missiles. Well, then the Iraqis destroyed those missiles, and the Bush administration said, well, at this point, regime change, that's not enough. That's not enough for regime change. And they kept using these vague threats and the sort of the specter of 9/11, which at the time, more than 50% of the American public believed that Saddam Hussein was involved in 9/11 for that reason, because they kept invoking 9/11. And in fact, Condoleezza Rice said, well, do we have definitive proof? No, but we don't want the smoking gun to come in the form of a mushroom cloud. There was a sense that amongst my family and my friends, including my parents and my grandparents, that my opposing this war, because I didn't see a justification for risking American lives, showed a lack of patriotism or lack of consciousness of the national security threats facing us after 9/11. Or that the bait and switch justification that as it came to be seen that there were in fact no weapons of mass destruction, that this was an effort to spread democracy around the Middle East, something that was promoted by Democrats like Thomas Friedman and Prime Minister Tony Blair of Britain, that I was opposing democracy, or that somehow I didn't understand the opportunities that this was allowing Iraqis to experience. Well, 10 years later, what do we have to speak of it for? According to WikiLeaks, internal United States government documents, 109,032 casualties, including 66,000 civilians, most of those Iraqis. Of course, 4,409 U.S. deaths, 31,928 wounded on the U.S. side. As many as 2,000 veterans of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars are now being helped by the VA Department, the Veterans Affairs Department, for homelessness. And while the official wounded numbers are around, as I said, 32,000, it's believed that as many from 20 to 30% of people returning from Iraq have traumatic brain injury. And of course, Iraq itself is not particularly a liberal democracy. In fact, it has become something in reverse of what it was, in that it is something of a Shiite strongman ethnocracy with a strong alliance with the authoritarian regime in Iran. Of course, the costs of war are extremely apparent as well, in that the most recent estimates from a Brown University study show that the entire war, including the costs of taking care of those veterans, will be $2.2 trillion. When put together with the interest on servicing that debt, it'll be $3.9 trillion. Costs of Social Security disability claims alone for those veterans is estimated 33 to 52 billion. But here's the important thing, and this is what I think that the American public is still missing on this count with the Iraq War, and that is that the American people turned against the war, but it seemed to me that they turned against it because it just seemed like it was going wrong. We had spent too much time doing a cause, and we were stretched thin, and we weren't succeeding, and it was hurting American lives and treasure. But I don't know how many Americans really actually internalized to this day the extent to which this was a war foisted on lies and fear-mongering, and the idea that we could go to war with any country that we wanted on our own because, David, as you said, they might someday potentially pose a threat to us. And if we're ever going to learn from our mistakes and prevent another Iraq war from happening, we need to understand how easy it is for the government to lie to us and wake up to that possibility and reform our institutions so they're more transparent and more willing to speak up against this patriotic fear-mongering. And that, in my opinion, is how it should be.